So this is the first lecture in Chapter 5, which is all about experiments and samples. We're going to begin with Section 5.1, talking about the idea of how to take a sample. And I want to begin actually with kind of an important term, which is, and by the way, this lecture is going to be very, very heavy in the definitions. Almost no numbers, almost no calculations, but really heavy in the definitions. So make sure you're actually kind of taking some notes on, there's a lot of terms I'll expect you to know. And the first two terms are experiment and observational study, and actually we need to compare the differences between those two. And there's an important difference. An observational study would be something where you're just looking at people and trying to collect some data. So for example, or when I say people, it could be any individuals. So for example, let's measure the height of a bunch of trees on the Sacred Heart campus. That would be an observational study. The key difference with an experiment is that you deliberately impose a treatment. And a treatment is something that you deliberately do to the individuals involved in the study. So if I just measure the height of trees, that's an observational study. But if I have, say, I'm going to give the trees some fertilizer and see if they grow taller or shorter, that's now an experiment because the fertilizer is the treatment. Okay? Similarly, if I said, I want to just compare, do students at Sacred Heart do better on the AP stat exam than students at Menlo? I didn't deliberately oppose a treatment. I'm just comparing, in this case, two groups. That's an observational study. But if I did something like I wanted to say, do students do better on the AP stat exam if they have lectures in person or lectures from a YouTube video, that's now an experiment because the type of lecture the style of lecture is now the treatment. Okay? So the big difference between an experiment always has a treatment. An observational study does not have a treatment. And we'll do several examples of this over the next little bit. The next vocabulary words we have to know are the difference between a population and a sample. And we've looked at this a little bit in class already. A population is the entire group of individuals you're looking at. So all trees, right? All students, okay? Whereas a sample is a smaller part of the population that you actually observe. So the best example of this would be if you want to do some study on teenagers, your population is all teenagers. Well, there's a lot of teenagers, so probably what you would do is you might pick 100 teenagers and just collect data on those. Similarly, when they want to figure out how the ratings for a TV show, the population is all people in the United States. Right? The sample is a specific smaller group of people that actually are randomly chosen to be part of what's called the Nielsen ratings. You see things like this all the time in the media now where there's an election going on, right, where they want to say 34% of people or say they're going to vote for this candidate or whatever. The population they care about is actually all voters. Okay? But in these early polls, they don't actually look at all voters. They actually take a sample of some smaller number of voters and then infer that that's roughly true from the population. And we'll talk about that idea a lot in the next couple days. So really what we're going to talk about quite a bit over this lecture is the idea of something called a sampling design, which is essentially the way you take your sample. And there's many different ways you can take a sample. Some are certainly better than others. And so we're going to run through about 8 different types of samples or 8 different sampling designs. The first one, you'll notice I call it number 0 because it's unclear whether this is actually a sample or not, is something called a census. And a census is a sampling design where basically your population is in fact the sample. So in other words, your sample, you actually ask every single individual in your population. Obviously the US government does this when they conduct a census every 10 years of every American. But you can imagine a census in other ways. For example, if I wanted to know what is the average GPA of Sacred Heart seniors, the senior class is not that large. It actually is very practical for me to ask every single senior. Why do censuses are really good? Why don't we take censuses a lot? Well, because in many cases, it's just the population is just way too large. It's just not really feasible to ask every single individual in the sample. So a census is great, but usually the downside of a census, can be really expensive, really time-consuming, and really kind of just difficult in practice to do. The next type of sample is actually probably the one that if I were to ask you to do a sample, you would do, which is, actually, I take that back. you wouldn't do this one, you would do the next one. Something called a voluntary response sample. And a voluntary response sample is that who is in your sample? It's individuals who volunteer. Individuals who volunteer. And this has a lot of problems. You see these all the time, like when you go on some web page and there's some little, who do you think is going to win the World Series? Okay. The problem with the voluntary response sample is people who volunteer tend to have stronger opinions than the population whole. As a population as a whole, usually voluntary response samples tend to overstate dramatic opinions, either really pro or really con. And you've seen this before. Like if there's some little web page that's who do you think is going to win the World Series? If you don't care, usually you don't click on the box. But if you do care, that's when you click on the box. And this is kind of done in other ways. I think I mentioned the example of Dear Abby, where if you had to do it all over again, would you have children? And it turns out that the people who responded to that was a voluntary response sample, and it very much overstated the people who had strong opinions. So be very careful when you do a voluntary response sample, because usually the people who volunteer tend to not necessarily be representative of the population as a whole. Okay, this next one is one that I think if I asked a bunch of seniors to do, they probably would do. It's something called a convenience sample. And a convenience sample is, who's in the sample? People who are convenient. People around you. Okay? So if I asked you to pick 10 seniors, who would you probably pick? You'd probably pick your friends or the people in your class. What's the problem with a convenience sample? Well, it turns out very often, if you just pick the people who are convenient, they're all similar, right? All of your friends are in some way like you. Maybe they're on the same sports team, take the same classes, things like that. Similarly, if you were to do a convenience sample, if I said, figure out the average heights of trees on Sacred Heart, you might pick the 10 closest trees to you. Well, they're all going to be like in some way. They might be the same species, get the same sunlight, things like that, right? If I asked you, to pick, the average average length of squirrels, you might catch the 5 squirrels closest to you, and they might all be related in some way or have the same diet. So convenience samples, again, not great. The next type of sample is actually something called a probability sample. It's a little bit more complicated, so I want to just kind of address it. What you do for a probability sample is each individual has an equal probability of being included in the sample. Has some probability, which I'll call P, of being in the sample. So in practice, let's say I wanted to take a sample of seniors. What I might do is, okay, for each senior, I'm going to roll a die. And if that die comes up 1, then you're in the sample. Otherwise, you're not in the sample. So each senior in that case would have a 1 in 6 chance of being in the sample. This is actually, we're getting a little bit better. I mean, that's pretty darn good. The downside of a probability sample is you really cannot control your sample size. In other words, if I said pick 10 seniors and do a probability sample, the problem there actually is that what if the die never came up a certain number, or what if it always came up that number? I might actually end up with no people in my sample, or almost everybody in my sample. So probability samples are less biased, which is a term we're going to talk about later on, but they do have the problem that really you cannot predetermine sample size. And by the way, the term we're going to use for sample size is something you've seen before. It's N. N is going to be always our term for sample size. Okay, these next two sampling designs are probably the most complicated two. This is probably the most common mistake people make in Chapter 5. It's the difference between a cluster sample and a stratified sample. So I want to be very clear and give you a few examples here. A cluster sample is you divide the population into clusters, and we'll talk about what that means in a second. And you pick a cluster, or pick a cluster, or maybe pick a few clusters. So for example, let's talk about Sacred Heart students. What you might think about is, okay, I want to pick a sample of Sacred Heart students. You guys are all in clusters based on your English class, for example. Okay? So in a cluster sample, I would pick one English class and then that would actually be my sample. Okay, let's talk about a stratified sample. A stratified sample, you do a similar thing, but you pick one individual from each cluster. Although usually you don't use the term cluster, you use the term strata. Although it's actually the same idea, it's just the same thing. So for example, if I did a stratified sample of Sacred Heart students, divide the population into strata, that's everybody's in an English class, and then pick one person randomly from each English class. Okay? Cluster sample, you pick one English class. Stratified sample, you pick one person from within each English class. Important difference. Okay, imagine I've got the city of Menlo Park is divided into square blocks, right? Everybody lives on a block. In a cluster sample, I would pick every household I pick one block randomly and pick every household on that one block. Stratified sample, I would pick one person from each block. Okay? Imagine I wanted to do a sample of NFL players. Well, everybody's on a team, right? Cluster sample, pick one team. Stratified sample, pick one player randomly from each team. Okay? Important difference. And it's really kind of easy to mix up.